Tēnā koutou katoa. Haere mai ki tēnei hui, ki te mana whenua rangitāne, he mihi nui, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Morena, welcome to the Planning and Strategy Committee for October. We'll just start with the housekeeping and safety procedures on the screen. So if we need to evacuate, we will follow our committee administrators out. Smoking is prohibited and there's a defibrillator out in the link span. If you have any issues, please let us know. So this meeting is being recorded and it will be available on the Council's website, and it's also being live streamed on YouTube. So something to look forward to if you're unable to make future meetings. So we will be voting via our electronic devices, and councillors, could you please give your name before you speak, since we are recording. So just to begin with, we'll just take apologies, and we have got an apology from Councillor Finlay. Are there any other apologies? Great, I will move those, seconded by Councillor Hancock, and I'll invite you to vote. Great, that has carried 100%. Moving on to additional items, and I haven't received any notification. Great. Item 3, declarations of interest. So I have got an interest in item 5 and 6, and for item 6, excuse me, I will vacate the chair and Councillor Hancock will chair that item. Received from the Deputy Mayor, item 8. Are there any other declarations to note? Great. Moving on to public comment, and we have had one public comment notified from John Bent. Morning, Mr. Bent. I understand you're making public comment on item 8.
Thank you, Anna.
You've got 3 minutes. You can start when you're ready.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Councillors, as you just heard, making comment on the report from the Chief Executive on item 8, the Huia Street Reserve. We've been there, this council has been there, done that. And you can read the outcome afterwards because that's being circulated to you. But I will read from the opening sentence of the second paragraph. It is usual that local bills come to select committees with a community mandate behind them. I've done my analysis of the submissions, and at best, I can say they're erroneous, or at worst, I can say they are deliberately misleading. And I quote from submission number 4, which is entered in the summary of submissions as one in support of development. I oppose the building plan concept on an architectural basis. Use this area as a pleasant garden and green corridor into the city. It does not support development for housing, yet it is counted as such. The report before you has that item down as having 21 submissions in support. In fact, there are only 20. Now, of the total of 80 submissions, as I said, I did my own analysis. A majority of 43 support the use of that land for community purposes in a whole host and variety of forms. And quite simply, that is going to be the basis of my submission to the House Select Committee should this matter proceed to that direction. Accordingly, I'm asking you to vote against going down that path, because I suggest the outcome for this council, as you see in if you read what's been circulated, will be the same again. Do what the council officers were directed to do in that report 14 years ago. Thank you, Madam Chair. Willing to receive questions.
Thank you. Councillors, are there any questions? Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, John, for coming to speak to us. As someone who wasn't on council at the time of the previous attempt to, I'm not quite sure how to put it really, to change the status of the land from being a reserve to something else, shall we say. Can you just explain what process went forward before it got to the select committee stage? Was there consultation on options like there has been this time? Did you have a chance to input?
I cannot fully recall exactly the exact process, but I do not recall anything that would suggest it was grossly different. And the other point, I didn't bring it here, is when you use the word consultation, I give the word the meaning that the Court of Appeal gave it in Wellington Airport versus Air New Zealand and others. And that is to be undertaken with an open mind, and only the party that has the power to make a decision has the capacity to consult. Staff do not have the capacity, the Chief Executive does not have the capacity to consult unless she has the capacity to make the decision. In this case, you are not deciding on the submissions that were heard in 2 months ago, but you were deciding on the recommendations of the Chief Executive. And that, to me, is not consultation.
Okay, thank you. Do you think that there's, from your perspective, is there any difference between the situation that existed, I think, in 2005, and then it went on to 2007 for the decision, and today's situation? Do you see any differences?
Yes. At that time, the bowling club buildings were still there. And and I will, right, if I go under comment on page 2 of what I've just circulated, which is the middle paragraph. Retention of reserve status will not affect the investigation of options underway. As far as I'm aware, there was no outcome from that.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Councillor Dennison.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, John. One of the other differences you described was the buildings being on the Huia Street Reserve, but in the context of housing, which this proposal is open to, could you agree that the demand for housing is quite different from 2007 when this was finalised?
Yes, it is. However, what I will say is to repeat what I said during the hearing of submissions, is increasing on climate change basis is driving the increasing consumption of energy by having more housing, supportive of combating climate change? And B, why does Palmerston North need more housing? Because it's predicated on economic development. But, in my view, the same can be achieved by simply doing things better. You do not need more people to advance the economic interests, in my view, of Palmerston North. Therefore, you do not need more housing.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair.
Are there any further questions? Great, thank you, John.
Thank you. Thank you, councillors.
So I will move that the committee resolve the public comment be received for information, seconded by Councillor Hancock. And I'll invite you to vote. Great, that has carried 100%. So moving on to item 5, we are hearing the submissions for Ahi Kore Smoke-Free and Vape-Free Policy 2020. So we will resolve that the Planning and Strategy Committee hear the submissions from presenters who indicated they wish to be heard in support of their submissions, and that the committee note the procedure for hearing of submissions as described in the procedure sheet. So I will move that, seconded by Councillor Dennison. Thank you. And I'll invite you to vote on that. Great, that has carried 100%. So our first submission this morning is submission number 12, John Lowell, and that is on page 28. Right, it doesn't look like John is here, so we will move on to submission number 223, Cancer Society of New Zealand Manawatu Centre Incorporated, and Kerry is here to speak to that. So this is page 262. Morning, Kerry. So you'll be familiar with the traffic light system that we're running. So you've got 10 minutes, and that includes time for questions. So if you want questions, just make sure you allow time for that. We've got 7 minutes on green, 2 minutes on orange, and 1 minute on red. And you can start when you're ready.
Thank you. So kia ora koutou. Thank you for this opportunity. So I'm Kerry Hokard of the local Cancer Society. We're a community organisation that's independent and has no affiliation to the tobacco or vaping industry. I belong to the Council's Smoke-Free Reference Group, the interagency group responsible for the review of this policy. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the consultation process undertaken by Council staff, giving the community a real voice on this issue. Over 200 people, schools and community groups shared their experiences and hopes of a solution to this new challenge to our health and well-being. So what's happened since the council meeting in June when vape-free outdoor areas were added to the draft policy for community consultation? Since then, I've spent time researching, talking to secondary school staff, parents, teachers and community groups. I wanted to know what impact vaping was having on our community. Was vaping really 95% safer than smoking? And what impact does nicotine have on young people? And were the vape clouds really just steam? I discovered that international researchers have found that today's e-cigarette products are very different to those of 2013, when it was first said that vaping was 95% safer. Today's models have greater power output, producing more aerosol. The greater volume of aerosol exposes users to increased, more concentrated levels of nicotine and other toxicants. Bystanders are also exposed to these increased harmful levels, and it can be especially harmful for asthmatics. Flavours that are considered safe to eat are not designed to be taken into the lungs, with e-cigarette use increasing heart rate, blood pressure and increased risk of coronary, heart and respiratory disease. At a national level, New Zealand research raises serious concerns about the increase in young people vaping and an associated increase in smoking. Risks include the potential for nicotine addiction and the impact of nicotine itself on cognitive development, stressing the need for us to protect our young people's health and well-being. Charlie's story gives a human face to this research. Charlie, a typical New Zealand teenager, described himself as a teen nicotine addict. He was 11 when he first started vaping. The main appeal to me was that it smelled good, it tasted good. It's the way people tell you about it. They're so enthusiastic about it. They tell you it's good for you and it's completely harmless. So that's the thing that hooked me in. The skate park kids told him how to buy the devices and their sweet hits online. It was easy to use his mum's credit card. Cotton candy, blue raspberry, peach coconut iced tea, any flavour you can think of, Charlie says he's tried it. He tried out more than 30 different vaping devices in the 2 years he was addicted. The nicotine made him feel good. And when the 24 milligrams per millilitre of nicotine juice stopped giving him a buzz, he stepped up to 60 milligrams. His mother wondered what had happened to her gentle son. He wasn't sleeping, he wasn't showering, doing his homework, or even interested in life. Nationally, the Smoke-Free, Vape-Free Amendment Act was passed earlier this year. The new Act aims to make e-cigarettes less appealing and available to teens by banning advertising, toughening up the R18 sales limit and restricting flavours. It's my hope that there will be trained staff in specialist vape shops offering the advice and support that people need to quit smoking. Locally, the council survey on attitudes towards smoking and vaping showed strong local support for treating vaping and smoking in the same way and making smoke-free environments vape-free. It was encouraging too to see the community recognising other community spaces that needed to be smoke-free and vape-free. However, the council report illustrated a need for a coordinated awareness campaign with community and local business education and support, clear, effective messaging, budget for signage and resourcing to make this policy work. So, let's expand the smoke-free outdoor areas policy to include vape-free outdoor community spaces. Let's reduce the risk of vaping becoming normalised, particularly among non-smokers and young people. Let's minimise role modelling of vaping to children and lessen the risk that they see vaping as cool recreational behaviour. Let's reduce public confusion and make smoke-free, vape-free easier to enforce. Let's put the health and well-being of our community, and in particular our most vulnerable, our children, and future generations at the heart of our decision-making. Let's reduce the rates and impact of smoking-related cancers in our community. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Kerry. Councillors, are there any questions? No, thank you very much for, oh, sorry, yes, we do have one jumped in. Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks, Kerry. Just wanted to pick up on your points that you've spoken to now about expanding the area and just reflect on the situation that we see in the current area, and it's documented in some of the submissions that we don't achieve necessarily full levels of compliance where we already have that ban in place. And just wanting to really understand from you whether you'd be comfortable with that expansion given a knowledge that it might not actually have full efficacy in terms of achieving complete compliance. And I guess the risk around that, potentially sending the wrong signal that people would just be flouting the rules.
I think very much at the beginning stages is about creating awareness that the policy exists. Without that awareness, it's like that awareness has to come before the behaviour starts. So to have the signage, to create this as a normal environment, that's the beginning that we need to be aiming for. This vape-free is smoke-free and vape-free is something that councils right across the country have been grappling with, and it's really encouraging to see now. I think there's 13 out of 13 councils have now either adopted smoke-free policy and vape-free policies or are actively working towards it. So this is going to be something that's actually going to be going right across New Zealand, that we will be making this commitment, because we now know so much more about the risks of vaping. So I do think at the beginning stages, it's the awareness that sort of hopefully will lead to a greater social acceptance that this is a normal way to be, that, you know, this is a community, an environment that's smoke-free and vape-free. And I think gradually we'll see that behaviour change, particularly as less people, hopefully the smoking rates will start to decrease.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Kerry. There's no further questions. Our next submission is Anish Daniel, submission number 121. Is Anish here? Right, we might just reorder our submitters because they have been told particular times. So I understand Anne Shaw is here. So this is submission number 126 on page 151. Good morning, Anne. So you've got 10 minutes and that includes questions, and you can start when you're ready.
Thank you very much. Kia ora koutou. I am a public health practitioner with over 60 years' experience working in the field of prevention. I'm also a grandmother of 10, and I have been actively involved in smoke-free advocacy since the 1980s. And I wish to start my statement by saying the end product of smoking and vaping is exactly the same, and we should be very much aware of it in this era of pandemic. My first experience of seeing evidence of the damage caused by smoking occurred in 1961. A surgeon in the operating theatre where I was working showed me the inside of a 20-year-old's lungs. He had lived all his life in the country and smoked since his early teenage years, and the inside of his lungs was black. In those days, cigarette companies left cartons of free cigarettes in the nurses' lounges. They knew that the cigarette addiction would provide long-term people for them to use. That, needless to say, that was my last day of smoking. Exhalation of heated substance is not natural and causes trouble for the respiratory tract, including the mouth. And the latest from a lot of dentists is that they're seeing results of people vaping with the same thing. And the New Zealand longitudinal study shows this by evidence. Just because a substance may be less damaging than another one doesn't make it safe to inhale, be it tobacco, pot, or rose petals. Smoking and vaping harm those doing it, as well as those individuals who may inhale the side stream smoke or vapour. Smoking is defined as expelling moisture and other inhaled substances suspended in air, exactly the same as vaping. COVID-19, ID-19, has been shown to be easily spread by exhaled breath, We are living in the past if we don't take notice of that now today. And vaping especially produces large fumes of exhaled breath. So in this era of pandemic, any smoking or vaping in public is a highly ignorant action, and not one that the citizens of Palmerston North wish to own. We need to act immediately and ensure that both vaping and smoking take place in private only, with the consequences of the participation being fully understood by those who take part. I just wish to say we need to get up to date and make Palmerston a place where people want to come. And for those who haven't started, say, be smart, don't start. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Councillors, are there any questions? No questions this morning. Thank you very much, Anne. Can I just check, is Christina Guide here? So that concludes our submissions this morning. We are moving now on to item 6. So we'll just take a moment for Councillor Hancock to come up and he'll chair this item.
Right, thank you everybody. Look, we'll just move on to item 6, which is a summary of the submissions on the proposed Oahi Kore smoke-free and vape-free policy.
For procedural, are we not moving item number 5? Did I miss it? Did we vote on it?
We moved that prior to the submission, the actual submissions being made.
Oh, okay. So.
Thank you. So item 6 is the summary of submissions on the proposed Oahi Kore smoke-free and vape-free policy, and for that, that's to be presented by Julie McDonald. So Julie, are you here already? Thank you. So I think most of it can be taken as read, but you might want to clarify some aspects of the submissions.
Kia ora koutou. No, don't have any aspects to clarify unless there are questions from councillors. Lily's available to answer those as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions of Julie? Yep. So, Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Julie, for the report. Just wanted to, I guess, understand a little bit more about the process in terms of analysis of the submissions received. My reading of the first question is that it does sort of lend itself to a yes-no sort of format, and that it was asking whether or not it should be extended to include vaping. And I felt that while the analysis gave us, I guess, a lot of transmission of content of what was on submitters' minds, it didn't really bring us back to a point of really understanding what the balance was between preference for extension or not extension. Just wondered, did you try to extract that information? Was it potentially available?
I'll get Lily to comment more specifically. I guess the only comment I would make more generally is that we very much try not to run referendum processes for consultation, so we're looking for the richness of commentary rather than necessarily coming back with a percentage. It's quite topical, isn't it, really? Rather than a topic, you know, a 51-49 sort of situation. So we're trying to provide the flavour of commentary rather than necessarily getting into a what did a very small majority think or not think. but I'll get Lily to comment specifically. The other thing I would say, though, is that we took this consultation from the position that council already has a smoke-free policy. We didn't take it from a first principles approach of saying, shall we have one? This was, we took the councillor's direction that we have a smoke-free policy. What do submitters think about extending that policy? So I guess it came from a particular position, and that probably meant that we constructed the consultation in a particular way, rather than perhaps should we develop a policy at all. But I will hand over to Lily.
Thank you. Yes, so if you have a look at the submission form, there is the yes and no question, but then when the explanations that people give, sometimes it's not, I guess, it's unclear whether they, in the commentary, whether they are in support or not. So it was, the analysis was going through going through the commentary and extracting from there, I guess, the themes of what is it that they were trying to get across, because it wasn't exactly, as Julie said, a referendum type approach to the issue.
Great, thank you both. Perhaps if I can just follow up, Julie, with your comment around, wanting to avoid referendum-style consultation. Quite agree with that, but just then wonder about the choice of framing the question in effectively a referendum style by saying whether there should be an extension versus an open question that might say, what do you think about extension?
I think there's a question there that you're asking me. I'm not entirely sure.
So I'll clarify that the
Yes,
question is, are we asking the right questions when we frame them as fairly closed yes/no type questions,
Sure.
or if we're going to meet your ambition of avoiding referendum style consultation, do we actually need to ensure that we're asking open questions?
Yes. I take your point. I think it's a good question to ask, and I guess the answer is it depends, and we're probably trying for a balance. So we want to give councillors some information about the general view. I guess what we're trying to achieve is a balance of some richness of information, as well as because there is a closed question in this instance. Council has a view on smoking, and so we weren't in a position of developing a policy where we could sort of say, vaping, what do you reckon? Council actually had a view, so we wanted to make that transparent, I suppose. Yeah, but point taken about the construction of questions. Yeah.
Thank you both, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Julie. I probably have got a question too, I guess, which is really around, in terms of the way that it's been framed, is it likely that we're more likely to get respondents from people who are in support of extending it to include vape-free, rather than those that want the opposite?
It's probably hard to tell. I mean, if you read the commentary, and if those councillors who were about last time this policy was reviewed, you may recall that we had some extremely vehement oppositional submitters come and speak about the freedom to smoke in open space, particularly as the bylaw was reviewed. So I guess, as with any consultation process, all we can do is go out and say, this is the issue that the council is considering, and invite people to participate.
Okay, thank you. And Councillor Hapeta.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Julie, do you think as a council, just a general question, do we get criticised for our consultation style? And is this an example of where we've confused our consultation style, where we've confused what, they don't know what we are asking in this instance?
No, I don't think that is a fair representation of this process. I think it's a very good consultation process.
I'm not trying to criticise.
There are two parts of your, no, I know. There are two parts of your question, and the first was, do we get criticised? I'm unaware of criticism of this process.
Okay.
And the second is, have we confused the questions? And the answer to that is no, I don't think we have.
Okay. And this definitely wasn't a criticism of the officers. It was just a discussion around whether council is confusing consultation in any way, and I just want to tease that out.
I think I've answered
Okay,
that question.
thank you. Thank you.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks. Julie, I just wonder, I take your point about the need to include the sort of qualitative comments and so on that are produced in submissions. But would it not be helpful for an indication for councillors to have some idea of percentage of supportive submissions versus non-supportive? Because in order to find that out now, we need to sort of go through every submission ourselves and tally them up. So whilst I appreciate your comments about needing, you know, the richness of feedback and so on, which has been provided, I wonder if there is an option to include numbers as well as that, instead of just doing one or the other.
I guess I'd just reiterate Lily's point that sometimes it's not clear because of the way people choose to answer questions. So when we come back with the report recommending changes to the policy or any further changes to the proposed policy, we can try and provide more direction in that way.
Yeah, so even if it was, you know, so many for, so many against, so many unclear, I personally would find that helpful in addition to the rest of it.
Sure.
Thank you.
Right, that actually exhausts the questions. Thank you very much, Julie. So the recommendation is before us there on the screen. Who would like to, anybody like to move that? Councillor Denison, and seconder. Yep, thank you, Councillor Bowen. Right, we'll go to a vote. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, are we going to be allowed to make comment?
Sorry, beg your pardon, Councillor Johnson. Do we have any comment, please? Thank you. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. That I think the issue of consultation, how we weight submissions, how we receive the summaries, these are all important aspects in helping council to come to a decision about an issue. And so I think some of the questions around the summary were sort of pointing to the fact that there are a number of factors, certainly, that we use to come to a consensus decision. And one of them, not the only one, is the weight of support for and against a particular proposal. And so there's just the concern from me that where we don't have numbers in submissions like this, that it may obscure the weight of support one way or the other. And so whilst I appreciate all the commentary, which is great, I think numbers are important in this. And if there's a vast majority of people submitting one way or the other, then that needs to be recorded and also factored into the decision making. So I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Harpeter.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. We do get criticised as a council for our consultation processes, and I'm just going to follow up on what Councillor Johnson has said. Sometimes we don't tend to ask the right questions, and then we sometimes get it wrong with our consultation processes. And I think, again, whether we are asking the right questions or whether we're not asking the right questions, sometimes we aren't coming up with an answer. And I just feel like sometimes we're not kind of getting it right. We've had this in other instances on other consultation processes, and sometimes we're not kind of getting there. So we've got to get our consultation right. We've got to ask the right questions and come up with an answer. And sometimes we don't come up with an answer. And I feel like this is another case of that.
Councillor Denison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a slightly different point of view. I think we have asked the right question. I just don't think it's been captured in the summary. The question is quite direct. Do you think that smoking outdoor areas policy should be extended to include vaping? I think that's pretty clear. So I think we have asked the right questions. I just don't believe we've captured the ratio of who was for and agreed, yes or no. And so that's my difference of view on that. So I just wanted to...
Thanks, Councillor Dennison. So that concludes comments. So I'll take a vote. Thank you. So that has passed 13 votes to none, so it's unanimous. Thank you very much, and we'll just hand back to Councillor Rutherford.
Right, so moving on to the confirmation of minutes on page 297. We've got the recommendation in front of us that the committee resolved that the minutes of the Planning and Strategy Committee meeting of 9th of September 2020, Part 1 Public, be confirmed as a true and correct record. I will move those, seconded by Councillor Hancock. Is there any comment? Great, I will invite you to vote. That has carried 14 in favour with 1 abstention. Moving on to item 8, the future use of Huia Street Reserve, page 301, and I will invite David Murphy to present this item. You can just start when you're ready, David.
Kia ora koutou, councillors. Morning, Madam Chair, councillors. So I've got a short presentation which I'll take you through to support the report on your order paper today. Just before I do that, I want to acknowledge we've got Nick Jesson from Cooper Rapley available. So there was a memo attached to the report prepared by Nick. So Nick will be available to assist with any questions in terms of his contribution to the report. So just briefly in terms of the process so far, you know, the current strategy and plan suite within the council, particularly the city development strategy and the housing and future development plan, has a strong emphasis on addressing the housing supply issue and council's role in that. And I'll touch a little bit within the presentation in terms of the various hats and roles that the council has in terms of addressing housing issues. We've had the statement of proposal, which was approved late last year, and then there was some consultation which finished in February. We then had the COVID period. Submissions were heard at the August Planning and Strategy Committee, and in terms of some next step decisions, those are to be made today. There are a number of processes to come in terms of this overall project. So the next process, assuming the resolutions are passed today, would be to work with the government to seek an amendment to the Palmer Reserves and Powering Act 1966. There would then need to be a district plan change and detailed design and consenting. Probably one further thought in that to come in terms of process, there would also need to be obviously more direct engagement with the council about the types of housing that would be delivered on the site. So there is no decision today about the type of housing that will be delivered on the site, whether that's housing that is sold or whether that's housing that is held by the council. So I guess the key point there is the resolutions in front of you today do not authorise the Chief Executive to actually make any decisions about the delivery of the type of houses on the site or whether they're sold or held by the council. That would all come later, and there would be a report back. So the resolutions today are really about authorising the change to the Act, which then enables the council to consider the sale or partial development, and that would of course come back, and there would be those subsequent planning processes as well that look at the detail once a decision was made about the type of housing that's delivered. It was touched on in questions and responses to Mr. Bent's public comment this morning, but there is a significant housing shortfall in Palmerston North, and that's reflected in our city development strategy and our housing and future development plan. The Manawatu Bowling Club site, or the portion of the Hui Street Reserve, has been vacant since 2005. I guess just a couple of stats to help emphasise the significance of the housing shortfall in Palmerston North. So MB data indicates that rents have increased for the 12 months to August 2020 by 11.3%, and house prices have increased by 14.8% for the 12 months ended July 2020, and a pretty scary fact, that's a $1,280 per week increase in the average price of homes in Palmerston North. Just an extract from our city development strategy. I've talked about that a couple of times. So, council has a significant property portfolio that can be used to contribute towards city growth and development while also providing revenue. This could include repurposing underutilised land or identifying land where uses can be relocated to enable sustainable housing development and intensification. So that's an exact extract from the city development strategy. I touched on this earlier, but I guess one of the things I'd like to emphasise this morning is that council has a number of roles in terms of housing, and I think we need to think about which role we're fulfilling at which time. So we are a social housing provider, and we're all aware of recent investment into Papaioa Place. We're starting to dip our toes into the development game, so there is progress occurring on the development of the land at Whakaronga that council owns for a greenfield subdivision proposal. There's the opportunity to repurpose land for housing, which is the Hui Street proposal, which is in front of you today. We also have a policy and planning role in terms of the district plan. So, for instance, we have substantially changed the traditional greenfield zoning rules in the last, as part of the last sectional district plan review, to encourage a mix of smaller houses in greenfield areas. We've also changed the district plan to enable intensification and encouraging those mixed lot sizes. So there's a policy and planning role as well as those roles I've mentioned earlier. We also have a delivering change function where we're working alongside developers to encourage them to look at alternative forms of housing. One of the things we're finding in that space is, despite the fact we may well even design sort of high density developments and guarantee consent for those types of developments, the market is still nervous about investing in that space at present, but that's a continuing work in progress. And we also have sort of broader leadership. We have the Housing Steering Group chaired by the Mayor, and we also have the opportunity in terms of things such as Hui Street to look at delivering different housing typologies to try and show confidence to the market if they're unwilling to invest in those areas. So I guess that the emphasis of this slide is we shouldn't think about trying to solve every housing issue with every housing decision we make as a council. There's a range of housing issues and there's a range of responses, and we need to think about the individual response on an individual basis. I guess I would qualify that by saying, as I said earlier in the introductory sort of slide, that you do not need to make a decision today about the housing typology that's delivered on the site. It's about enabling the process to continue so that a council in the future can consider what type of housing or mixed-use type of development is delivered on the site. In terms of the statement of proposal, there are 5 options. So that was enabling the sale or development for housing, land banking the site, developing for recreational purposes, considering proposals from the community, or enabling the sale or development for a commercial purpose. Some high-level comments, I guess, on the submissions. There was a mixed response. There are a number of submissions identified issues that are better addressed at subsequent stages, so we don't need to tackle every resource management or planning issue today. There will be district, if this process proceeds as recommended, there'll be district plan change processes and resource consent processes that can look at, lighting and noise and traffic and all of those things, and those processes are best placed to address those issues. There was some support and qualified support for housing, so some of that qualified support was if there was high density that it had to be well designed with urban design controls and those sorts of things. And of course there was support for retaining it for recreational and community use. And there was a number of suggestions in submissions about potential uses. One of the submitters, probably one of the more directly affected submitters, of course, is the Manawatu Lawn Tennis Club. They were concerned about reverse sensitivity effects. So that's what the housing may mean for their continued operation as a tennis club. Again, those types of issues are best addressed through detailed design and planning processes. It's not a residential tennis interface. It's not an uncommon interface across the world, and there'll be mechanisms in place to be able to manage those effects and provide certainty to the lawn tennis club. We can also provide certainty regarding the long-term future use of the current portion of Huia Street reserves through lease agreements and zoning. So the Manawatu Lawn Tennis Club currently have a lease with the council, and you'll see that there's a recommendation there for the Chief Executive to continue to engage with the Manawatu Lawn Tennis Club to look at ways of amending that lease to provide further certainty around their long-term future operation of that site, or use of that site, sorry. District plan zoning can also provide certainty to the Manawatu Lawn Tennis Club. So if if this process proceeds as per the recommendations, and there was for instance, a residential zoning applied to the undeveloped portion, there's no reason why if we had a longer-term lease with the Manawatu Lawn Tennis Club, that you would retain a recreation zoning on the Manawatu Lawn Tennis Club portion of the site, which reflects the long-term use of that portion of the site for recreation. The Manawatu Lawn Tennis Club, in their submission and in our conversations with them, talked about the fact that they also have a desire to have an indoor facility, not as significant as the facility they have at the moment in terms of number of courts, but the potential for an indoor facility. So what the recommendations do, in summary, is leave the door open for a mixed-use development containing housing, indoor tennis, and a small commercial activity on Fitzherbert Ave, or potentially at the back of the site. That could be a cafe or bar, or double as a club rooms or something like that. But importantly, it would be up to the Manawatu Lawn Tennis Club to make the case to council. This overall project has a number of processes to go. For instance, changing the 1966 Act may take 6 months to a year. We'll then have a district plan process, detailed design and consenting. So all of that provides time for the Manawatu Lawn Tennis Club to further investigate and complete a feasibility study about if they were to look to use a portion of the undeveloped site for an indoor facility, how that would be funded and delivered. And if they can put that case, and the body of the report talks about the process they would need to go through in terms of assessing overall sporting facilities. There's been a process put in place for that So it's no guarantee to the Manawatu Lawn Tennis Club, but the recommendations, as I said, leave the door open for that process to continue alongside the procedures that the council needs to follow. As I said earlier, there was a supporting piece of legal advice from Nick Jesson at CR Law. You'll recall that the statement of proposal talked about either looking at the 1922 Act or the 1966 Act, and Nick's advice is that there were two options, but we're best placed to bring the reserve under the 1966 Act. Importantly, doing that is entirely consistent with what the 1966 Act anticipates. It's an act to empower the council and the City of Palmerston North to sell and manage lands vested under the Palmerston Reserves Act 1922. So we'll be bringing a piece of land that's managed under the Reserves Act 1922 under the 1966 Act, which is specifically designed for that purpose. Importantly, Nick's advice also noted that we do not consider that the amendment process discussed above could be utilised in respect of part of the reserve only, and that's because it's recorded in one record of title. And that's why we've also included those specific recommendations that while the total reserve may be brought under the 1966 Act, we can provide certainty to the Manawatu Lawn Tennis Club around their ongoing operation through other means, which is lease and zoning. So despite the fact that the amendment would apply to the whole site, there are two other forms of mechanisms that provide that protection to the Manawatu Lawn Tennis Club, and they're explicitly provided for in the recommendations. As I said earlier, this housing typology, we do not need to make a decision on that today in terms of the form of housing that's delivered, whether that's held by council or sold. The statement of proposal included a range of potential housing typologies to demonstrate how the site could be used. I've talked about that second point there. We don't need to make a decision about that typology today. I guess I just would make the observation that given the location, it does present a good opportunity for the council to show leadership by delivering medium density housing, which is a typology not currently being delivered by the market. And the reason I say it's a good site is really because of its ease of access back to the CBD and its location close to amenity. Typically, if you're going to deliver higher density development, history suggests and evidence from across the globe really is that high density living needs to be close to amenity, so you can exit and enjoy, in this case, the river and the esplanade quite quickly. You're on a bus route in terms of your ability to head out to the university or into the city, or equally it's a relatively easy walk or cycle to the university or the city. So in that case, it does present a good use for that site. Again, you do not need to make a decision today on that typology, however. Next steps would be to implement the recommendations, connect with the relevant government departments and the Palmerston North Member of Parliament, and continue to engage with the Manawatu Lawn Tennis Club regarding their feasibility study and aspirations. So those can be considered alongside any other potential mixed-use recreational development. And again, I just emphasise that recommendation about a potential mixed use for the site wouldn't rule out any other sort of recreational activity coming forward and engaging with the council to be considered alongside any proposal, any firmer proposal from the Manawatu Lawn Tennis Club. So, yeah, happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, David. First question is Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think probably just to start us off, David, my question is about the comment you made in the report and in your presentation about a number of issues have been brought forward in consultation and community discussion that will be best dealt with by later processes. So I wondered if I could seek a comment from you about how we give confidence to the community that those issues, which they see as presenting issues at this stage of the process, won't be lost because they don't fit with the legal process that we're in. So the things that you talked about, like lighting, noise, traffic, the practical impact on life in Palmerston North City, which people are concerned for, but we're not actually talking about yet.
Yeah, and my comments were not to dismiss those comments. They're legitimate concerns. And I guess the answer to that is if the recommendations were passed today and the changes were then made to the 1966 Act, the submissions, excuse me, the submissions that are lodged to this process, we would make sure that those are carefully thought about in terms of any zoning process that would then follow in detailed design. Equally, we would then, if the legislation is passed, we'd be engaging in a workshop with council to say, well, the legislation's now passed, how would you like to develop this site? Presumably there'll be some progress from the Manawatu Lawn Tennis Club or other potential users. So I would see a workshop sort of scenario with the council to say, we've got through the legislation. Remember, we had these types of submissions. How can we think about those types of effects in terms of the way in which we progress the detailed design and development of the site?
So to follow up, I think my concern there is that comment, remember we had these kind of concerns. Is there a formal process by which the submissions and the concerns raised in this process are taken forward into those later processes?
There's not a formal connection, but there's no reason why you couldn't, for instance, pass a resolution that the submissions received on the statement of proposal are used to inform future decision making by the council. But that's something we would do as part of good process anyway. It's not, even though the answer is these submissions were specific to the statement of proposal, but we would certainly bring them forward in any future discussions should the council pass the resolutions in front of them today.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Councillor Harpeder.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thank you, David. Just listening to your last comment, I just don't know if this question's already jumped the gun. So have you had any discussions with Manawatu Tennis already?
So we met with Manawatu Lawn Tennis Club when the submissions were open, and we talked about them lodging a submission. We talked to them about the reverse sensitivity effects and that there were other mechanisms to provide certainty regarding their long-term future use. We also met with them probably 3 or 4 weeks ago as we were finalising this report. So certainly what's outlined in the report is a and the conversation we had with them is in my view, an accurate reflection of the conversation we had. I did ask the Manawatu Lawn Tennis Club to provide a letter of sort of support for what we were proposing. That never came through. So we have met with them. We've met with them twice, and certainly I think the recommendations are and the commentary within the report reflects the conversation and addresses their concerns.
So are they in agreement with what you're proposing? What's in the body of the report and the recommendations from my perspective reflects the conversation we had with them. I asked for a follow-up letter from them to confirm the nature of the conversation we'd had. That never arrived. I did make them aware that when this report was public, I emailed them a copy of the link to the report, and they were also, and that it was being presented today. Thank you.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, David. Can you explain why there's been no development of this parcel of land since 2007?
There was, I understand it was considered as part of a property review. I know Aaron Phillips is in the chamber that he did probably 4 or 5 years ago, but it wasn't advanced as part of that process. So I think maybe other than the council being a bit gun shy about what happened last time in 2007, I have no specific understanding as to why it hasn't been progressed, but Aaron may want to comment.
Apologies, should have come to the table. It was in the list of properties that were considered during the property review, but you may recall, those who were there at the time, the properties were sectioned up into 3 tranches, and we put forward what were considered the most straightforward set of properties in the first and second tranches. The third tranche included Huia Street Reserve, which was considered special enough to be separated out from the general property review. Following the first couple of tranches of property review, where councillors decided to retain a lot of the reserves that were considered as possibly being reused for other purposes or sold, the final tranche was never brought forward in the work programme.
Thank you. So, in terms of the comments that you've made before and today around the market not providing high density or medium density housing, how do you suggest going forward? Let's assume that this all goes through, the land's rezoned residential. If the land's sold to a developer, are we able to influence the density of housing that goes onto it?
Yes, and that can be achieved through a variety of mechanisms. And that would depend on how much involvement or non-involvement the council wanted to have in the development of the site. So one mechanism is you could have a site-specific zoning for the site that was developed, that was quite specific in the outcomes that were being sought. The other, of course, is that the council could simply develop it, build the houses itself. The third scenario, of course, is that the council designs and consents a particular outcome and then partners with somebody to deliver what's been designed and consented. So there would be a range of models that could be used to develop the site, and some with higher council involvement, some with less council involvement. I wouldn't want to get too much in the detail of the pros and cons of those different models today, because that would really be a conversation for later on. This is about setting the council up to be able to consider those types of scenarios at a later date.
Okay. In terms of other parcels of underutilised land that council owns, could you tell me why they are not being considered? So, for example, I know of several parcels of land that are already zoned residential that council owns that could provide a more immediate response to the housing crisis. Why are they not being considered?
There's a range of sites that a small team within council are starting to look at. I guess I'd make it clear we do not have a property development team within the council. This is a collection of staff who are amongst their other usual tasks, are coming together to look at options to deliver on what's in that city development phrase and that city development strategy. So, there's the Summer Hay site, which there's been some public conversation about. There has been some initial work done on the current depot site on the corner of Ferguson and Albert Street. Certainly some further work required there in terms of that facility was relocated. So there are a range of sites that are being looked at, and those other sites that you've mentioned that are already zoned residential, I'd be interested to know where those are and whether they're on our current list of investigations. I guess one of the reasons why Huia Street, we started that relatively early in our overall path of this housing, using council land for housing. Why we started Huia Street early is just given the layers of processes and that are required to be gone through to actually deliver development on the site. So it was prioritised early because of the complexity of the site to get the processes underway. While we're also, of course, made good progress on the development of the council land at Whakaronga, which has absorbed a significant amount of that team that I talked about's time as well. So,
okay. So you suggested there that you weren't aware of land that council had that was zoned residential. Is that correct?
I'm aware of the Whakaronga site. We have had staff looking at other sites that are are available for development. So I'm aware that there are small portions of reserves and land in parts of the city. So I guess I would emphasise that the team is looking at other options, but Huia Street, we started a process alongside those other pieces of work, just given the complexities of it, to make sure we're getting some progress.
Okay. So in terms of, and I appreciate this might be a question that you're not able to answer, but in terms of the establishment of the Urban Development Authority, which was established in August, and the proposals from all sides for RMA reform, do you anticipate that we really need to use this reserve land for housing, given that on your own admission it might take a couple of years to free it up? Do you think that those other changes to legislation might actually provide us with an answer to the housing problem sooner than the process to do all of this?
My answer to that would be that the council has been pulling a significant number of levers to try and address housing. My presentation talked about 5 or 6 different roles that the council has in terms of housing. We've been trying to pull all of those levers, and housing is still continuing to increase at over $1,200, or houses over $1,200 a week. So my advice is that the council should be doing anything and everything it can to address housing, and the use of this site is one of those.
Okay, I've just got one more question, if that's okay. So do we have an idea of how much it's going to cost to go through this process, assuming that it's agreed to? And do we have a budget for that?
We don't anticipate that it'll be significant costs, and that can be addressed within existing budgets.
So just to be sure then, the legal process, the changing of the Act of Parliament, all the legal advice that's required around that, the district plan changes, and the design and consent can all be done under current budgets?
Yes.
Thank you.
Councillor Meehan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to follow on regarding the Lawns Bowls lease, currently how long is that lease for, and when does it run out? When is it up for renewal?
I think they've got, where's Bryce? I think they've got 5 years to go. And then they've got a right of renewal. So we in the meeting we went through the details of the lease, and then basically agreed that we would continue to engage with them to talk. Despite what the current lease says, if both parties are willing, you can change that lease at any time. So if these resolutions pass, we would engage with the Manawatu Lawn Tennis Club to look at ways in which we can amend that lease to provide them more certainty.
Okay.
But at the moment, we recall it's 5 years with a right of renewal.
Okay, I just recall in the submissions, they were looking for a longer term of lease. So currently it's 7 years, is it?
5 with a right of renewal for another 5 from... but okay, the key point is, regardless of what the lease is at the moment, the recommendation is that the Chief Executive engages with the Lawn Tennis Club to extend the lease.
So who makes the decision on the length of time for the lease?
That'd be a conversation between our property manager and the Manawatu Lawn Tennis Club. I understand they come to the Mayor for signing.
There are some restrictions through the Reserves Act for the total length of a lease, but that's essentially 30 years, so we have quite a lot of room to play with. And in terms of the negotiating of the terms, that can be done by officers, and then it goes through the signing off process accordingly.
So bottom line is, overnight they could be given a longer term lease?
Yes, providing that all of the processes are signed off accordingly and it's within the realms of the Reserves Act.
So, okay, so we talk about processes to be signed off. Under their current lease, what they're acting under at the moment, could they get a longer term lease under their current situation?
So because it's technically on a reserve at the moment, a report would need to be brought to council for a resolution to be sought to be entering into a brand new lease on the site. In which case, yeah, the terms of that would be part of that report as well for consideration. Providing we follow that process, there will be a little bit of consultation that will need to happen with the community as well, which is in line with all of our leases on any reserve around the city. Providing council provided those resolutions to proceed, yes, we could enter into a term much larger than it is currently with a renewal term.
Right. So under the current situation, we can't give them a longer term lease. It has to go through a process and they have to meet certain requirements.
Correct. So I couldn't just draw up a lease agreement tomorrow and just get them to sign it, and we could sign it and
no, but I suppose what I'm asking, what I'm looking at is that, so officers could alter what's in their current boundaries of the lease to basically hold a noose around their head on the terms of their long-term lease. Well, they can't get it under currently what they're under at the moment.
So they currently have the right, regardless of whether this process proceeded or not, they currently have the right to fill out the rest of their term, which is roughly another 5 years, plus another renewal of a further 5 years. Irrespective of anything that happens today, they have that right from there. If we're looking to alter those terms and make it a 10 plus 10 or something to that degree, then yes, it would need to come back to council for a resolution, and we would need to consult on that being a reserve.
Okay, my understanding, Dave, was that was a conversation already happening.
Councillor, is this a comment or a question?
Question.
Can I just make a comment that there's no hidden agenda here? The recommendation is that the Chief Executive engage with the Manawatu Lawn Tennis Club with the objective of providing greater certainty regarding the long-term future use of that part of the site that they currently occupy. They have a lease. We have to acknowledge the current lease, and the recommendation is that you ask the Chief Executive to go away and provide them more certainty by extending the lease.
Yeah, okay, so I suppose I'm just trying to establish, the question is how hard it is for them to proceed to get a longer term lease. Why we're taking so long to get them a longer term lease?
I think the questioning's been answered. Is there any other questions, Councillor Mann?
Yes, there is. I don't think the question has been answered. The scout hall on that, and behind that property, is that included in this? Is it included in the property for development?
If it's on the parcel, I'd have to check whether it's actually on the parcel of land that's defined as the Huia Street Reserve. If it is, then it's included. If it's not, then it's, yeah, I'd have to check.
Thank you. Can you come back to me on that? Thank you.
Councillor Dingwall. Oh, sorry, Councillor, just before you start, can I just ask if any staff are coming down to provide additional comments, can you please introduce yourself as we're recording the meeting and people don't know who's speaking? Thank you, Councillor Dingwall.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, David, for this report. So I've got a few questions, but I might just try and wrap it all up into one. How easy is it to change reserve status on a piece of land? How easy is it to actually put this forward? How often does it happen? You know, yeah.
I think given that we've been working on this for over a year already, and we've got at least probably another 2 or 3 years to go, it's a complex process.
So at the end of the day, if we decide to go down this path and it ends up going through the next phase, will then the decision makers be looking at this document and deciding then whether they're going to approve the sale of reserve land or not? I'm just thinking that at the end of the day, when it goes to those decision makers, how likely is that to even happen, given today's current market?
I can't answer that question, other than to say that the recommendations in front of you today don't give the authority to the Chief Executive to sell the land. They give the authority for a change, that the Chief Executive to change, to start a process to change a piece of legislation that will enable a future council to consider the partial sale or development of the site.
And so is it likely then that once this went through the next process, it would be approved? I'm just, in terms of, what's the precedent here?
That decision's made by Parliament, so that's, the officer can't comment on whether it would likely be approved or not, because he is not in a position to make that decision.
Yeah, so I guess what I'm looking for is more sort of precedent out of it, you know, with land that's been classed as reserve in the past, how easy has it been for either our council or other councils to take that land and then change the status of reserves?
I mean, councils across the country are increasingly looking at these types of assets for a whole bunch of reasons. We know that councils are, well, there's a housing issue, a national housing issue, but also there's, you know, increasing rates, affordability, increasing debt. So councils across the country are facing similar sorts of issues to what this council is facing, which is it needs to look at alternative ways of gathering revenue, it needs to look at helping address the housing issue, and it needs to look at pieces of land that have been sitting vacant since 2005. So Auckland Council, for instance, had a close look at all its golf courses that were on sites, and so this is not an uncommon conversation that's starting to happen. I think as the issues cities face today are quite different to the issues they faced when this legislation was passed in 1922 and 1966. And you know, the 66 Act actually, the specific purpose of it enables the council to think about doing the things that it's thinking about doing today.
So aside from the Auckland example, do we know of any other councils who are going down this path of potentially selling or redeveloping reserve land at the moment?
Well, we know that there are a number of councils that are starting to look at development as an option as one of those levers that it has to help address the housing issue.
And then when we're looking at that question of sale or development of that land, and I know that you have spoken about, you know, things happening in different further on parts of the process, are we more likely to have something like this approved if we were just looking at the development side of things as opposed to the sale and the development of this land, given that we have had some fierce resistance in the past?
Well, the likelihood of it being approved is up to the people around the table today. So what you'll be doing is, if you pass these recommendations today, you'll be enabling the future council to consider the sale or development of the site. I think that the legislation amendment we've suggested is the most simplest way of enabling a future council to consider that. And as I've said a few times now, there's no authority today being sought to sell the site.
David, Mr. Jesson's signalling that he would like to join you at the table and make a comment.
That's right. I'm Nicholas Jesson. I just wanted to help out in that last question a little bit, because you can't develop the land without having the sale done. So we do need the change to the Act to be able to develop it either way, because it's still got the reserve status on it, so you can't develop on it while the reserve status is there. So you need to facilitate that. And on the sale of the land, the trusts, which is the reserve status of the land, would fall away, which would allow the development. So whatever happens, you need that power of sale in the 66 Act to be able to develop it.
So, sorry, so just to clarify, so is that saying that that is the sale of, not of the land to anybody else, but that land, I guess, to us? Is that what we're trying to do here? Right.
Well, it could be. It could be sale to, but the subdivision and sale of the land is necessary to get rid of the reserve status. But that might be presumably the sale to the council for a council-run development, just depending on who's going to be doing the development. But the problem is the reserve status there. So it sort of ties back to another question by Councillor Johnson earlier on as well about whether the new enactments coming in are going to help out and whether this is potentially a waste of time. No, is the answer, because the reserve here is the problem. And the new enactments coming out won't help you because you've still got a reserve over that land, which is the key issue that needs to be addressed. So this is about, and my memorandum addresses it, this is about enabling the council to proceed with various options to develop the land. And currently, with the reserve status on it, that can't happen.
Okay, I think I'll leave my questions there. Thank you.
I might suggest you just stay put for a little bit longer. Next question is Councillor Barrett.
Sorry, Madam Chair, can I just make a point of clarification?
Sure.
So my question to Mr Murphy around the changes in the Urban Development Authority and the RMA reform was not as it relates to Huya Street. It was in general how it affects our ability to provide for housing. It was not that I thought that those enactments would somehow have an effect on Huya Street itself. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, David and Nick. Yeah, I thought I had it straight in my head until I started hearing the more recent answers and trying to really understand the claim around a necessity of sale to achieve a development outcome. I well understand the necessity of removing a reserve status to achieve a development outcome. What is the necessity for sale?
Well, where the land sits right now is under the 1922 Reserves Empowering Act, and first of all, it has no power of sale, so we've ticked that off. But if you wanted to revoke the reserve status on the land, you would need to use the 1977 Act. So first thing is you'd probably need to bring it out of the 22 Act anyway. So you've still got an amendment that's necessary. And then you need to go through the revocation process under the 77 Reserves Act. And at the end of the day, that is, as I understand the law, not a decision of the council. It's a decision that rests with the Minister of Conservation. So that's a decision that's not in the council's hands. So one of the reasons why we've preferred the approach of amending the 66 Act and vesting it in the council under that Act is because it leaves the ultimate decision in the hands of the council. Just one qualification of that is Councillor Dingwall's asked the question about the likelihood of the process being successful. So as part of the process that's required to amend that Act, what I would envisage is some consultation being necessary anyway with the Minister of Conservation. So it doesn't totally, I don't want to suggest it's all the council's decision here, because it does need to get approved by Parliament, which will of course involve the government's procedures and their standing orders for amending local legislation, but that's why.
So is it that currently the Crown is the owner and would need potentially to sell to council or another entity to get it into local control then? I guess I don't understand still. Yeah,
so you can't do anything with the reserve status on it. Sorry, I'm just setting out the steps along the way. So you could, the two options are to somehow get it under the 77 Act and revoke the reserve status. That is one option that we've set out. We're not preferring that option for the reasons that I explained a moment ago. We're preferring the 66 Act option because it has that power to sell and because that power to sell rests with the council. It's a simpler, more straightforward process, although still of course, more complex than the usual development of land.
Great, thank you. I might just redirect to try to get to the, I guess, the point I'm trying to clarify in my own mind. So, David, would it be possible to achieve a housing development outcome while retaining public ownership of this land?
It would. However, I think what we're saying is the changes that we would seek to the 1966 Act will not change whether we're selling or developing the site ourselves. So the changes we seek from Parliament will be no different as to whether we want to develop the site ourselves or sell it. And while the resolution says to enable the partial sale or development, that comes back to my earlier point that all we're saying at the moment is we want to change the legislation to keep those options open, but that would be a decision for any future council. So what we've suggested is the most simplest change to legislation, which enables the council to manage that land on its own accord.
Thank you. So I guess just to understand then why the rationale around making explicit reference to enabling sale if in fact it's not necessary to achieve the outcome.
So we say the partial sale or development, and again, those words were specific to say that it's really about because if, for instance, if you remove the word partial sale, development could still mean sale. If you develop, so for instance, until the council makes a decision on the typology of housing that it wants to deliver, that will influence whether sale or development or retention is the best option. So we haven't wanted to complicate this process by saying we're going to deliver this type of housing, this type of design at this stage, and preempt all of that. What we've said is we want to make a really simple legislation change which pulls this piece of land under the 66 Act for the council to make a decision about how it manages it. It's a future decision as to whether it's sale or development, obviously whether it's sale or retention, that will be based entirely on the type of model or typology of housing that's delivered. So, and what we're saying is under the recommendations you've got, you'll have the council will have the ability to make that decision.
So if council today were to express, let's say, a preference for ongoing public ownership and achieving a housing outcome, would that be a showstopper at this stage?
I'll just check. My initial response is no, and that it wouldn't change the nature of the amendment we're making to the 66 Act. But I'm just going to check with Nick. I don't think so. And I suppose the point I want to convey is, and just to clarify as well, when I use the word sale, I'm not meaning sale to an external or a private person necessarily. It's the power to deal with the land. So subdivision, and then the council would retain the part that it wants to develop. So I read that all consistently with the word sale in the current recommendation. So I don't read partial sale as partial sale to a third party or a private person. It could very well just include the council itself. Perhaps if the word just said to enable dealing with the land or development of Huia Street Reserve, it might be less of a confusion and would still be suitable for David's purposes.
Thank you both for those comments, Madam Chair.
Councillor Beattie.
So just to seek clarification then, and thank you for the report. If council wants to develop the land itself and doesn't want to sell it, just wants to develop it, we don't have to put sale in there. Or if we were halfway through a development or looked at a development and decided that we wanted to to sell, say, a 50th piece of it for, because of something we're not aware of now, would taking that reserve off stop that?
Sorry, you go.
I mean,
my answer to that question was is by bringing it under the 66 Act, it allows you to, the words are manage the land, including sale.
I think that, if I may just comment, not commenting, I'm asking a question. The issue is, in the public arena, sale means selling the land to a third party. So could we have language that basically covers what we want to do without having that forced sale in there?
Can I just jump in, sorry? For clarification, if we change it to operating under the 66 Act, then is actually the detail of the recommendations here irrelevant, because it would then operate under that Act, which includes managing or selling. So I think councillors, some of the comments, some of the questioning seems to be getting at the point that Councillor Beattie just raised around the public view of what that word sale means. And so if that was removed from the recommendations, if it falls under the 66 Act anyway, that doesn't preclude future sale of pieces of that. Is that correct?
Correct. I would say, on looking at these words, that you could remove the words partial sale and just go with development in that recommendation. What I do need to emphasise, though, is that, of course, the power of sale is the very reason why we need to have it in the 66 Act, because we can't do the development without that legal power.
Councillor Beattie, did you have any further questions? Councillor Hancock.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Look, I'm not sure whether my question or my interpretation of all the conversation that's gone before this, whether I've got clarity or not. But I just really want to, I guess, confirm the first part is this is actually a step process. That's a question.
It is a step process, yes. Yep. There would be a number of decisions to come.
And the council can't make any decisions around repurposing the land for either housing or recreation until such time as the reserve status of that area is actually made. Is that correct?
Well, you could use it for recreation today, of course, but if you were to want to repurpose it for a mixed-use development of recreation and housing as suggested, then we need to change the Act, yes.
Right. Thanks very much. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Councillors, are there any further questions? No. Councillor Naylor.
Sorry, my button doesn't seem to be working today. Thank you both for your presentation, and I think mostly my questions have been answered. But just to, the only further question really is, if we do change the wording of those recommendations and take out the partial sale part and it just say to enable development of Huia Street Reserve, will that in any way limit the options of any future council to determine the development model going forward?
My answer to that is no, but I'll just get Nick to check as well, because the nature, as we said earlier, the nature of the changes that we make to the 66 Act won't change whether it says whether the resolution says sale or development, because what we wanted to do is just bring the piece of land under the control of the 66 Act, which and the Act itself enables sale or development.
Okay, and just the only other question. Oh, was there something further? The only other question was I couldn't quite understand the reason that the wording had been partial sale as opposed to just sale, and whether there was some thinking about whether that would limit perhaps for all of it to be developed and sold down the track.
So I think the key thing here is the whole piece of land will become under the if this resolution is passed, the whole piece of land comes under control of the 66 Act, which enables the sale or development. The words partial sale or development was trying to indicate to council that there's a range of options to the way in which the site can be developed, but we're wanting to sort of narrow the funnel a little bit, because there's no intention. Well, certainly there's no intention from the officers to sell or develop the piece of land that's currently used by the Manawatu Lawn Tennis Club, despite the fact it will come under the control of the 66 Act, and which is why we've provided that additional certainty through lease and zoning for the Lawn Tennis Club. So the words partial sale was really about we only intend to develop or recommend to council that they develop the undeveloped portion.
Can I add to that? There is no power under the 66 Act to sell land which is leased. So the word partial there also, it does specifically engage with that discussion about the tennis court. If there is a lease in extension for 10 years, then that part of the land can't be sold.
Okay. Thank you, that's really helpful.
Mr. Mayor.
Madam Chair, if there's no more questions, I'm quite happy to move 1 to 7 with an amendment to number 2 with partial sale being deleted.
Thank you. I'll just double check. Are there any other questions? Okay.
Just note partial sales reference in a number of the resolutions.
Yes,
so,
yes,
Yeah,
we've got an amendment for that. Thank you, David and Nick. Right, so the recommendations are moved by the Mayor. I'm happy to second those. We have had a couple of amendments come forward already, but we will I'll leave it to individual elected members to jump into the queue to speak to those. And so as the mover, I will invite you to speak first if you'd like, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So if we've got that partial sale to the administrators, if that is crossed out, I think, what is it, 2, 4? Thank you, if they could be deleted. And look, thanks to the officers, because, and I do ask for your support on these recommendations 1 to 7, and I'll give you some reasons why. This is a really big decision, and I appreciate there's probably some tension in the gallery there. I think there's a massive difference from the council's previous 2007 decision, where it was a totally commercial sale to a McDonald's or a petrol station type scenario. This is a very different proposal. It's focused on housing and the supply outcomes. The city, region, in fact the country, has a real dire housing supply issue at all levels of the market, and certainly here in Palmerston North that applies too, and it's only getting worse. It's a classic supply demand issue, and we do need to add some housing supply to it. Look, I appreciate the submissions on this land have been mixed, and everyone has a view and a right to express them. I'm also aware that our environmental people, the Guardians, will be totally against my moving of this recommendation, but I'd expect no different from them, because they are very invested in the environment and green space. And my comments to them and councillors is this piece of land is surrounded by almost 50 hectares of green space, recreational space, and that's sort of been totally forgotten about in some of the discussions. We absolutely need to be careful in changing any reserve status of land. There needs to be checks and balances in place, and I think that the questions have really teased those out, because they simply don't make any more land. Once it's gone, it's gone. But I do believe we're well placed to make that call and make it carefully. As the officer said, it's a stepped approach. At present, this land's only growing weeds, but that's not a reason to get rid of it. And it's been unused for many years. And again, that's not a reason to change it as well. There needs to be a protection for the Manawatu Lawn Tennis Club for their security of tenure, and that's been teased out by some questions. But just to go back to this land, it's surrounded by 23.2 hectares of recreational and reserve land with Wallace Park, Awatea, Ongley and Manaroa. Ongley and Manaroa
have over 17 hectares right next door. Plus, there's 26 hectares of the esplanade. That's nearly 50 hectares of land within 500 metres of Huia Street, and some as close as 190 metres to the land in question. So arguably, it's surrounded by the biggest, densest population of green space in a regional New Zealand city. Again, a fact that's been overlooked by many of the debates. But it needs to be carefully designed, and I think all we're doing today is doing the staged approach. The design, that needs to be worked through with neighbours, including the girls' high school. They had some reservations, but I'd have to say, speaking to them, of other people that were different to the people that presented, they had different views. So look, it needs to be worked out carefully and designed carefully. And the recommendations will start that staged approach, as the officers have indicated. I think it supports our city's development strategy, and any funds that are derived from this, remember they're tagged, they have to go back to reserves. So there is a plan B or an end game for the environmental people. So the future of housing, what it looks like, the lighting, the noise, the traffic, the mitigations, all of those will need to be worked through with some process. And look, councillors, please, doing nothing is not an option. I really don't think it is. So I do ask you to support this. Thank you.
As the seconder, I'll just make a couple of comments. I'm in full support of this. We've got here an opportunity to enhance a piece of land which currently has very little value to our community. Housing is urgently needed in the city, as the Mayor's spoken through, and we've got plenty of green space within minutes of this site. Today's decision doesn't rule out models or opportunities around what that housing could look like or who could own it. This is actually just the first step in doing something with what is actually currently wasted space. So I would really like to see this pass today. We have got a few in the queue. We'll go with Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Certainly an interesting decision in front of us, and reserve status is one of the real, few bulwarks that actually sit there to protect public assets. And my view is we should only really proceed here with an extraordinary amount of caution, and seeing those many notes of caution that have been presented in the submissions. However, I do see this particular case as quite a unique case to consider, and one that I am broadly in support of in terms of looking at potential housing and community development options. And my rationale for that is that I think we have a singular, unique intersection of location, need, and opportunity, and we should be exploring that. However, I'm not yet comfortable with the recommendations that sit in front of us. While the Mayor has removed the word sale, I think we should go further and be explicit at this point and affirm an intent around ongoing public ownership of the land. So I'd like to see an amendment to include the words retain public ownership of land and enable partial development. The justification around that, which I'm happy to briefly speak to, is as follows. Firstly, public ownership still enables an end goal of providing housing and possibly commercial or recreational use. And in fact, I'd say that it enhances it in terms of our ability to have greater control over the type and quality of any development over the long term. It will allow partnership options, such as long-term leases, shared ownership of buildings, etc., to still be considered. Basically, it keeps our options open at this point. We don't need to be making any indication today around sale, and while we are no longer proposing to make an indication around sale, I think we should go that step further and be explicit around an intent to retain public ownership of the land. I think as well, this approach shows some consideration for the aspects of concern put forward by the submitters around the ongoing and long-term public good use of this land. So in short, enabling development on part of the land while keeping the land in public ownership, in my view, speaks to the housing and urban development needs of our times, while also going some way to honoring an original intent of public ownership for the public good. But it is important that we be explicit around our intent to retain public ownership of the land, and so I'd ask you to support this amendment. Madam Chair.
Thank you, councillors. I'm going to work my hardest to try and keep this process very clear. So we are now going to be speaking to the amendment and dealing with that first before going back to the substantive motion. So I have got a queue of people wanting to speak to the substantive motion. So if you are wanting to speak to the amendment, I'll just ask that you could give me a signal with your hand. Thank you, and I'll just go to Councillor Petrinas and offer you, would you like to make any comments as seconder?
I just fully support the comments made by Councillor Barrett.
Thank you. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I, speaking to the amendment, would say this, that I don't believe that we should be building housing on this reserve, and I don't believe, therefore, that we should be initiating the necessary amendments to the Palmerston North Reserves Empowering Act 1966. Now, I appreciate the attempt by Councillors Barrett and Petrinas to retain public ownership of the land, but that in itself, in this amendment, is not sufficient to protect this piece of land going forward, because the effect of initiating the amendment to the Palmerston North Reserves Empowering Act 1966 and bringing this piece of land under that Act is, as I think was quite clearly described to us by legal counsel, is to give council the power of sale. So there is absolutely no protection in this, either for it being retained in public ownership long term, or for it remaining as a reserve. So councillors may think that by passing this amendment that there's some protection on future sale, but there isn't, because as we all know, any amendment can be overturned by a future council. I fear that if we open the door to potential sale of the land through the use of the 1966 Act, that eventually this land will be sold, and therefore I will not be supporting this amendment.
Councillor Naylor.
Madam Chair, I actually have a question of the officers regarding this amendment, if that's okay. Can I ask that question?
You can ask the question and then I will advise whether the officers will answer the question.
My question would, if we proceed with this amendment, will it limit options or decisions made in the future?
I'll allow the question.
I think the answer to that is Councillor Johnson is correct. If the land is brought under the 1966 Act, then the power of sale is there. However, if this resolution is passed, then it's a resolution of council that would need to be overturned by a future council if it wanted to sell the land. Because what we're saying, it's a resolution of council that the intent of this proceeding on this process is within the envelope of public ownership.
Thank you, David.
Thank you. I'm happy to speak to the amendment. I won't be supporting the amendment. I appreciate the thinking behind it, and I realise, me personally, I'm really supportive of the overall direction, and I'd like to keep our options open. At the moment, retaining the ownership and developing it could potentially cost council a significant amount of money, and we haven't got that amount in front of us. We don't have information to inform that decision, but I'm concerned that going down this track will limit our options to partner with other organisations to achieve the outcome, and it will also potentially limit, it won't limit insofar as that a future council can overturn it, but I think my comfort level would be to keep our options broader at this stage, even though the decision we're making is really only to progress it to the next step. This amendment does indicate a level of intent, and from my perspective, I think we are better off to keep our options open and keep those options to include those opportunities for partnerships with other organisations or developers.
Councillor Dingwall.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So this one is quite a tough one for me, being a fierce advocate for the environment and also a fierce advocate for housing. It's quite a difficult one to balance. But right now, Palmerston North doesn't have a crisis of reserves. It has a crisis of housing. The reason why this particular land has been neglected for so long is because we've already been down this path. Our community does not like it when council sells off reserve land or thinks about selling off reserve land, and we've already heard that in the submissions. We've seen it in the public outcry in the local papers, so maybe this time we do need to be yet bolder and make some different decisions. Maybe this time we shouldn't automatically assume that we might want to sell the land in the future, because the status quo, what's happening with that land at the moment, isn't working for anyone. I think a lot of us can agree here that we need to develop this land. And I think a lot of us can agree that we are experiencing a housing crisis. And most of us can agree that this location is actually well served for, other reserve land. So maybe we should focus on developing the land and ensuring that the public know that our intention is not to just sell this land off to developers the second we can. I feel that we should be treating this land with the respect that has been lacking over the years. We could build we could build housing there, we could build a community, but in doing so, in approving this amendment, we could also take the wider Palmerston North community with us. And I think that's what's been missing all these years. So I would be supporting this amendment coming from both the environmental side and the housing side. I think this is the way to go.
Are there any other councillors wishing to speak to the amendment? Councillor Dennison.
Thank you, Madam Chair. What this recommendation does is severely limits the possibilities down the track. What I would love to see is us supporting the vital first step, which is what was first proposed, and I was very comfortable with removing the words "the partial sale of," but this is actually steering us down one path. You talk about the Reserves Act, there's no environmental crisis or reserve crisis, and that's probably true. The Mayor mentioned that we've got over 40 hectares within a stone's throw of the location. It's very ideally placed with the Esplanade Ongley Park and others. We have a housing situation, and it's this doesn't limit the housing option either, but what it does do is put the financials onto the council, and they are unknown, and in fact they could be quite burdening, and that's not just for the build, that's for the ongoing maintenance potentially too. And without having the information to consider fairly, I cannot support this. I cannot support this. I'm aware of how costly building homes can be, and I'm not confident that the council can do it at the best mode, and therefore, without any of the information around how people would rent them or lease them or have rights to occupy, it just seems like we're going down a path blinded without any report or information that scoped it. And so I think this is narrowing it. I'm not for it. I'm definitely against this amendment. Thank you.
Councillor Hancock.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I'll be very brief. I'm actually against the amendment as it's been presented, and even though I really do appreciate the sentiment that lies behind it, I just have to remind myself that this is actually a step process, And the first part of the process is just changing the reserve status of this piece of land. The amendment, I think, probably constrains us in terms of future options. So thanks, Madam Chair. Those are my comments.
Thank you. Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the opportunity of looking at this particular issue. I think, like many, I was interested in the different proposals that came forward through submissions, many of which spoke to this idea of retaining public ownership, and it's certainly something I'm very interested in us looking at and pursuing, but at a later state in the process than what we have now. My feeling on the impact of this amendment is it's actually effectively just whitewash at this stage. We'll be in the process, which is the amendments to the Palmerston North Reserves Empowering Act 1966, which explicitly enables sale. So to say that our intention is not to sell is just expressing an intention, and I don't want to bind future councils to having to undo decisions that we've made without good information at this stage, even though that would probably be my decision at that future stage, should I be around this table and the world is as it is today. So for me, it's a no to the amendment. Thank you.
Mr Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And look, like the last two speakers, I agree. And I understand where the mover and the seconder are going, but we're putting a straitjacket around this council. And I think Councillor Dennison really, and Councillor Hancock, nailed it with two comments. It's a step process, and it actually binds us into something that we possibly cannot afford. And it really, we're going to the end game. It's a step process. It does limit our JV options, and it may be where we go, but let's do that with considered information in front of us. This is jumping right to the end game, and this is probably where we're going to go, but we can't go there yet, and I think for all the reasons that some of the previous speakers, so I won't be supporting it.
Councillors, any other comments on the amendment? Councillor Butt.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm supporting this amendment because I can't see a point in removing that partial sale words if we are not supporting this. If we are not supporting this, what's the point in removing those partial sale? If anyway, the 66 Act is going to enable us to sell the land. So what's the point in removing those things then? Thank you.
Thank you. I am going to put the amendment to the vote now.
All right, point of order, no right of reply.
Not for an amendment, under standing orders.
Thank you.
That has failed, 5 in favour and 9 against. We are now going to adjourn for a break, and then we will come back to the speaking queue and the substantive motion. We will come back at 11:20. All right, thanks everybody. We will get back to our meeting. So we are now back on the recommendations on the screen, which have been moved by the Mayor and seconded by myself, and we are heading back into the speaking queue for elected members who wish to speak to the recommendations on the screen. So if you'd like to make a comment, can you just check that you have pushed your button, just to make sure that we have got those wishing to speak, and we'll go to Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just getting my head back in the game. I'm speaking generally in support of the recommendations in front of us, as probably indicated under the previous discussion with the amendment. But I would like to bring forward an additional recommendation just that picks up the comments made in questions with the officer. I think my concern with the stepped nature of this process, and maybe links back to the previous discussion around consultation generally, is that issue that we do face in the community of consultation fatigue. I think in this situation, particularly with Hui Street Reserve, people will feel like they have already made a submission that captures their concerns. And as the officer said, many of the concerns that were brought forward were not specifically for this step of the process. They'll be more properly considered through a potential change to the district plan, through the consenting process, under any RMA considerations. But my concern is that people don't understand our processes. They feel like they've submitted once, and they might not do that again. So taking the officer's comment that good process would mean that these submissions are referred forward into future processes, I absolutely trust that that will happen. But trust and then confirm, I think. So this is a belt and braces approach, definitely, to suggest, as the officer said, would be appropriate, that submissions received on the Hui Street Reserve Statement of Proposal, so this process that we're in now, be referred to any future PNCC decision-making process about Hui Street Reserve, so that those concerns around, I think that the Mayor mentioned some of them in his comments, lighting, roads, traffic, will be referred to the appropriate place there. And I'd seek your support for that additional recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I'm speaking against the preferred option. So I'm happy to support that the report be received, but I do not agree with the initiation of the amendments to the Palmerston North Reserves Empowering Act 1966. So 2 and 3 I'll be opposing, and I'm speaking against this proposal as a whole. I don't think any of us would deny that there's a housing need in the city at the moment. There is. But I do feel that housing need is being put forward as the sweetener for us to accept changing reserve status on Hui Street land. And what we need to consider is, do we really need, are we so desperate for housing that we need to convert a reserve into a housing development? My submission is that we don't. There are multiple sites available both within and on the edges of the city that are either in the process of being rezoned or could be rezoned for residential housing, many of which could be rezoned much quicker than the convoluted and lengthy process that we're going to have to go through to get this reserve in a position to be able to be built on. So just for an example, Kakatangata, there's 5,500 houses possible to be built on that area of land. I think that would more than deal with the area of need in housing in the city. I am nervous when I hear officers talk about council being the developer for a form of housing that the market is not keen to develop. There's a risk there. If the market's not developing a certain style of property, it's for a reason. That's because they can't sell it. And so I think we should be very cautious about thinking that council would be the developer in any case. I note that we have changed our district plan to allow more intensification and that many people supported that. But as one of the submitters commented, that they supported the district plan change, but they never imagined that the medium-density housing would be on public reserves. And I just feel that there's no need for us to rezone this reserve. There's questions about the timeliness of doing so. And there's also some risk involved if council's proposing to be a developer. The other thing is that council on its own is not the answer to all of the housing need, either in this city or anywhere else in the country. In fact, government has recognised that there is a need to move at a faster pace to rezone and allow housing building, and that's why we've got the Urban Development Authority. It was only became live in August this year, so it's hardly had time to have any effect. RMA reform has been promised by both sides of the House, and I think we can expect in the next year or two that there'll be substantial progress on housing, during all of which time we'll still be in the process, as the officer stated, 2 or 3 years to go on Huia Street. And I'm very afraid that we're going to make a short-term issue cause us to make a long-term decision when we should be looking to the future of the city. As the Mayor said in his comments, once it's gone, it's gone. And I absolutely agree with him on that. Now, the strategic direction has been brought forward to justify some of this proposal, but we haven't had any comment on the strategic direction around being an eco-city, where we say that we're going to enhance, maintain and protect the environment. We haven't had any comments on Goal 3 about being great places for people to do their recreation. We haven't had any comment on the active community plan, where we note that we will be developing city-wide reserves, which are unique places to explore, learn and actively experience the environment. What we know is, and we state this in our policies, that people are happier and healthier when their activities are prioritised by decision makers. So all of that strategic direction needs to be considered, not just the strategic development that was discussed about housing. Now, coming on to the submissions raised concerns about the process and whether or not there was an element of predetermination. And given that council tried to rezone this, to remove the reserve status of this land in 2005, I can understand that concern, particularly when you look at the fact that council has done nothing with the land in between, and officers were unable to give me an answer as to why that was. The majority of submitters oppose the sale and the removal of the reserve status of this land. Of the 80 submissions, only 21 were in support of this proposal. Now, you can make of that what you will, but I would suggest to you that there is not substantial community support for this proposal when we only get 21 submissions in support. There were numerous suggestions in the submissions of other things that could be done with this land. Yes, it's next to large sports fields, but large sports fields are not places where people go and sit. They're not places where people have a chat to their neighbour. They're places where people go and play rugby. The small reserve on the corner, lots of suggestions were made about things that could be done with that land, in terms of perhaps a heritage garden, perhaps a Japanese garden, etc., etc. It could be any kind of niche reserve. And just because it's surrounded by the esplanade and sports fields doesn't mean that there isn't a need for that type of reserve in that type of place. I am concerned that we haven't really looked at the history. We haven't looked at the fact that in 2013, hundreds of submitters objected to the sale of reserves for housing. I was one of them, in fact. In 2005, the community went as far as to go down to the Select Committee to object to the sale of this reserve. I'm not really sure why we're going around this merry-go-round another time. I would have thought that we could have learned the first time, or maybe even the second. But the other thing to say is that this has been a reserve since 1876, almost as long as the city has been established. And in fact, in 6 years' time, should we still have it, of course, it will be celebrating its own sesquicentennial. The thing is that we've learnt this year through COVID-19 that people value places where they can just hang out in a public space. They value places that they can walk to in their own neighbourhood different reserves having different characteristics, and there's really no justification for building on this small piece of land. I think some councillors just need to think about what they want their legacy to be on this council. Not all of us will be here next term. Do we want our legacy to be that we got rid of reserves for housing? I don't think that that's justified. We need to learn from our past mistakes. And make no mistake about it, those who are talking about, oh, this is just the first step, there is an end game here, and the end game is to build houses on this land and to sell the land, because that's the only way that council can make the revenue. So if you vote for this today, you'll be opening this land up for sale. Make no mistake about it. The fact that Councillor Barrett's amendment failed should tell you that. And once it's gone, it's gone. So please consider carefully. Thank you.
Councillor Naylor.
I didn't think I was in the queue.
Great. Councillor Beattie.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Huria Street has had a history. I lived there when I was 4, just round the corner from it, and it was the bowling club till 15 years ago. Since then, it has been a paddock with a fence. There's been no submissions to council to develop that land for any recreation since I've been on council. In 2007, when 2005, when they wanted to change the status, that didn't happen because of all the commercial activity around at the time, and council didn't have a plan. All it was a motion to sell that land, which at the time could have been to any commercial operations. So there was never a plan, and there wasn't a housing crisis. In 2007, we had the global financial crisis, and that went on for years and years, and that was why that particular land just sat there and was land banked. And I think the decision not to sell that land in 2005 was the right decision. Now, 15 years later, there is a piece of land, one reserve. This is not about all the reserve status in Palmerston North. This is about one reserve with weeds and a fence around it, which is the most ideal site in Palmerston North for housing. It's close to the CBD, it's close to schools, it's close to Massey. Environmentally, I used to live around the corner. I never had a car when I lived there. I didn't need one. I could walk everywhere or bike everywhere. So neighbours, there's no neighbours. If you're looking at a medium to high density area, there's no neighbours around that area it's the perfect site for medium to high density housing in a housing crisis. We've got 500 people on our waiting lists for state housing, for our own housing. We've got kids in motels. We've got businesses who've got staff and roading contractors and that trying to get staff. We've got no rental housing. If you go through right down the bottom, right through to the top of the market, to executive middle housing, there are queues of people in this city waiting for housing and affordable housing. Apartments that were built 10 years ago were $400,000 and they're now $900,000. That's how housing has rapidly gone up in this city. We need to start looking at every opportunity. We need to look at Huria and Summerhays, and then I'm worried about Summerhays. That was a bowling club. So if we say, well, hang on, can't we develop Summerhays because that was a bowling club and that's a green piece of land. So every empty piece of council land that's green, can we no longer put housing on it because it could be needed for recreation. For the economic future of our city, we need to develop this housing. And what better place than on a corner as a showpiece to the rest of the country to show what Palmerston can do for urban design. And we could have a multi-complex there, including environmental, eco-friendly, with a using our imagination. But the most important thing, we will have contributed to reducing the housing crisis. And Palmerston North overall in New Zealand is one of the top 8 economies in New Zealand, and I think it's going to grow. And we're going to have more and more people coming into Palmerston, and we need this type of housing. It's all very well to say there's 5,000 houses going out at different areas. These will not be middle to high density housing. Where do people that are 60 plus on their own go to purchase quality housing? There's nothing in this city that they can buy. So I just say, please be open-minded about this and support this option. And we have the barriers in place right throughout this process that we can pull at any time and make sure that we're doing the right thing. Thank you.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and must say that the earlier vote around public ownership was actually quite a good litmus test, I feel, for the end game and the sort of risks that could develop over time there, and including the very real risk of loss of public ownership of the land that has been in public ownership for a very long time. And in case any of you don't recall how that vote went just before morning tea, it didn't go very well. So it has substantially diminished my appetite for this proposal, because I am unwilling to go down a process track that potentially gets us into a scenario where public ownership is not the final outcome for that land. I well recognize that even if we had taken that council decision, that it's an even lower level of protection than is currently offered under the reserves. So for me, I'll be voting now to support ongoing status of reserve rather than looking at options that, in my view, open up too great a risk of ultimately seeing this fall into private hands.
Councillor Dennison.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is the first vital step I mentioned earlier, and I was on the council back in the 2005, 6 and 7 when this issue came through. And at that point, it didn't even get through the first step. And so it'd be my hope that we could at least support it here strongly for consideration at the Environmental Committee of Parliament, so we can consider the possibility of housing. One thing around it's going to be lost forever. It's a green for green policy that the council holds, and so therefore any proceeds from this block will be reinvested into other reserves across the city. And we've already had a number of requests to be considered for improvements to existing facilities, let alone establishing new reserves. We've had a request, which has even come through this item, around covered tennis courts, covered bowling greens. Netball have had similar desires around exploring some covered facilities. We've got a massive project at the arena, and then there's a ton of other reserves around the city that we can invest in. And so I make the point why it might be gone on that location, we can reinvest and improve and expand other green facilities across our city. We are a growing city, and housing is a pressing issue. And the mixed style of housing that's been proposed for the site, I think, appeals for a range of reasons. It does give greater certainty around options that we can lead out on. There's a number of developers in the city that are drip feeding some land to market, which is keeping the price point particularly high because of the demand being so great. And so therefore, I think if we can have some more control in the space, that helps the affordability issue. It actually also improves the access issue. And we should be showing some leadership around addressing the issue. Others have made major promises, and we're still waiting for some of the outcome of those. But as a city, we have an opportunity here to show some leadership on this issue, and housing is a pressing one, and we know that well. The other issue, which is more a subset for this proposal, is the Manawatu Lawn Tennis Club, and that's covered very well around providing the greater certainty, our commitment to lead on that and ensure that they have their desires met and incorporated in the mixed proposal. So for all those reasons, I'm very comfortable moving forward and support it wholeheartedly. Thank you.
Councillor Dingwall.
This is a tough one. It really is. I think we're not actually looking at selling this land right now in these recommendations as they stand. We're not actually saying we're going to go through and sell it. In fact, we went through this whole debacle to try and have selling of removed from the recommendations. What we're looking at is the first step that gets us even starting the conversation. How do we start the conversation if we don't even do this first step? Right now, there is a massive housing crisis in this town, city. There is not a crisis of reserves. We do have all of that esplanade land there. For me, we need to look after this land, and right now, we're not doing it. And we haven't been doing it for many years, and that is actually our fault, because we didn't manage to convince the public back in the day to make any changes there one way or the other. I feel that if we go down this path and we say yes to the recommendations that are here, if by some miracle in a year's time we suddenly find ourselves flush with housing that is affordable and there's no one on our waiting list, then we can make other decisions later down the track. But if we just say no to this, then we're just saying, okay, we're happy with the status quo, and then what happens? Another 10 years down the line, we'll be back here again. So I really do feel that we need to look at what is in the best interests of our community today and in the future. Right now, we have a lot of reserves. We are looking after most of our reserves, aside from this one. So, you know, maybe we could do something better with this land. I am really against selling off reserve land, but this is not what the recommendations are saying. The recommendations are saying, let's investigate developing it.
Thank you. Councillor Hancock.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I'm actually going to support the recommendations as they are with us, and that includes the additional recommendation number 8. I too struggle with the idea that we might in fact actually convert a reserve into a building project. And I have listened very carefully to the submissions from Manawatu Lawn Tennis, Palmerston North Girls High School, Environment Network Manawatu, and the residents in terms of their views around what should happen. Presently there are, I think, north of 400 people on the housing waiting list here in Palmerston North. And yes, we do have greenfield options in terms of housing, but those greenfield projects really cater for 3-4 bedroom type homes and not smaller medium density type projects. The projections are that in Palmerston North over the coming years we can't in fact actually build enough houses to actually meet the need of the residents here in the city. So for all those reasons, and the fact that this particular location is actually on a main route, it's between the city and Massey University, we actually have an opportunity to actually build something that is different and meets the needs of the residents of Palmerston North. We can develop this in sympathy with the submissions that have actually been made by people who have actually come along to be submitters before us. We can actually include the needs of the Manawatu Lawn Tennis Club, And we also meet the needs of people who live close by Hui Street Reserve. So there is opportunities there for green space, opportunities there for medium density housing, and opportunities there for recreation. So just because we change the status, change the reserve status, does not mean to say that this council is actually going to ignore the needs of its residents. So I urge everybody to support the 8 recommendations. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Councillor Finlay.
Thanks, Madam Chair. And of course, I missed most of the meeting and the debate. And what I have heard has made me think, I was actually going to abstain and leave it at that, but I've heard some arguments and it's got me thinking. Now, I was here when initially when the bowling club were forced to move off that land because we took the corner. And that's why they did move away from there, because we took their land off them for the corner. So the bowling club who had the use of the land were forced to move out. And that's a different story. But we had a whole lot of people come to the council, and I've read what we've had for the submissions. And they had whole lots of ideas. There was going to be memorial gardens, and there was going to be the batonk, and there was going to be all these things that we could have put there. Now, for 15 years, I've waited for something to happen there. And unfortunately, nothing has come up in 15 years. In fact, to my memory, there hasn't been one suggestion come to council in 15 years of what we could do with that land. Because of the size of the land that's there, the bowling club had to move out because it wasn't big enough for a bowling club. So what sort of sport could you put there? There's none really to count sport out. So it was going to be a garden or something like that. And the Chinese garden was a suggestion at this stage. But no one has come forward and said, let's put a Chinese garden there. So does that mean it's going to sit there for another 15, 25 years as a weed garden? I would hate to see that happen, because at times it becomes a bit of an eyesore. The people come into the city, this valuable bit of land on that corner, it's just grown up with weeds. It makes it initially look pretty bad for the city. And then I was listening to Councillor Beattie, and she raised a point that I have I'm experiencing at the moment. We live in a large 5-bedroom house in Palmerston North. And my wife and myself, since our children have moved out, have decided we want to downsize. We can't go into a village because my wife's too young, and so am I. So there you go. So we can't go into one of the villages. But you try in Palmerston North to buy a reasonable 2-bedroom house. It's impossible. You go to one that's up for sale, and they're going $100,000 to $200,000 over rateable value. That's what's happening in Palmerston North for a 2-bedroom house. We have lots of people waiting for homes in this city. When we suggested to a real estate agent we have our 5-bedroom house put it up, there was interest in it. I went to Homes for People, we talked to them about it. They were very interested in it. But you know, the problem is, where do we go? Where do we do? We sell our house and go where? We can't buy anything else. So if we can put 2- and 3-bedroom houses in a reasonable size section on the market in the city, it is going to help not only people downsizing, but people who are looking for homes. And I think we seriously have to look at it. And I would have fought tooth and nail to keep this reserve. But as I say, it's for 15 years I've waited for something to happen there. And I haven't heard of one idea that has gone past just a thought. No one has come to this council at any stage in that 15 years and said this could be used for that. So I think instead of having an eyesore on the corner of Park Ave there, it's time we made something out of it and do something for our community. And by allowing medium-sized housing on that section, it's going to go help our city. So I am going to vote, even though I have not heard all the submissions, I am going to vote for it.
Are there any other councillors wishing to make comment? Great, I will go to the right of reply, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Look, I've come here with an open mind, as everyone should have. And councillors, I do again ask for your support on this, and I think for many of the reasons why the previous speakers. Look, it's been mentioned that 2007, 2013, and 2020, you know, we've had negativity over revoking the status, this reserve status. But actually, Councillor Beattie summed up all the reasons why. 2020 is very different. There's been talk of plentiful land available. I would actually have to challenge that. Otherwise, we'd be building more homes now. We have land banking here like every city has, and the majority of land is held by 4 or 5 major entities. We need 6,000 houses or sections in the next 8 to 10 years. That's just keeping up. And I would say that City West really relies on people selling their own land that they currently are using, where this site, Huia Street, is council's decision, we can decide how we want to develop it. Suitable housing, look, I totally get that developers haven't gone to this medium density yet, although I do believe there's one that's come into our consents department just recently. Look, developers have wanted to look at this medium density type housing, but and are really yet to test that market. But you've got to influence the influencers, and that's the banks, that's the real estate agents, that's the architects and consultants. And council, we have an opportunity to influence, or certainly lead that development. So I repeat, there is plenty of green space around this recreational sports space, actually just on 50 hectares. There's parks with seats within 300 metres of this site. Awatea Park is an example. The Esplanade, which is 500 metres away, is another example. Yes, there's sports fields, but they also have seats. Manawatu, Ongley and Wallace Park. So I'm a natural supporter of rec and sport. That's been my thing before I came to council. So it is difficult doing this, but it is the right call. And I would normally oppose changing a reserve status. But this is a very different need now. And it's a very real need. And I think it's been summed up by the majority of speakers that we actually need to look at the needs of our people right here and now. And housing is one of those issues. So please, we've got to deal with it. That's the real issue here. And I'd ask you to support these recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you. So we are going to take recommendation 2 and 3 first. All right, and I'm going to read that out. So the committee recommends that council approve the preferred option regarding the future use of Huia Street Reserve, which is that council initiates the necessary amendments to the Palmerston North Reserves Empowering Act 1966 and the district plan to enable the development of Huia Street Reserve for housing, including the potential for a mixed-use housing development containing supporting recreation and small-scale commercial activity. And that the Chief Executive be directed to engage with the relevant government agencies and the Office of the Palmerston North Member of Parliament to initiate the necessary amendments to the Palmerston North Reserves Empowering Act 1966 to enable the development of Huia Street Reserve for housing, including the potential for mixed-use housing development containing supporting recreation and small-scale commercial activity. I'll invite you to vote. That has carried 13 in favour and 2 against. So we'll now vote on recommendations 1, 4, 5, 6 and 7. So, recommendation 1, that the report entitled The Future Use of Huia Street Reserve, corner of Park Road and Fitzherbert Avenue, presented to the Planning and Strategy Committee on 14 October 2020 be received. I'll just continue to read them out through from the order paper while we sort out the screens. That it be noted that should the Palmerston North Reserves Empowering Act 1966 be amended to enable development of Huia Street Reserve, lease arrangements and district plan zoning can provide greater certainty to the Manawatu Lawn Tennis Club regarding the long-term future use of that part of Huia Street Reserve currently occupied by the Manawatu Lawn Tennis Club. And that the Chief Executive be directed to engage in discussions with the Manawatu Lawn Tennis... Is that what I just read? No. Manawatu Lawn Tennis Club with the objective of providing greater certainty regarding the long-term future use of that part of Huia Street Reserve currently occupied by the Manawatu Lawn Tennis Club, including reviewing the current lease arrangements and retention of the current recreational zone. And that the Chief Executive be directed to continue to engage with the Manawatu Lawn Tennis Club regarding the proposed feasibility study for an indoor tennis facility and supporting amenities, and consider this as part of a potential mixed-use housing development at Huia Street Reserve, noting the Council could also consider other recreational proposals as part of any mixed-use housing development. And that it be noted that should the Palmerston North Reserves Empowering Act 1966 be amended as it applies to Huia Street Reserve to enable the development of Huia Street Reserve, the subsequent Resource Management Act 1991 District Plan change and resource consent process will require an assessment of the potential environmental effects identified in a number of the submissions received on the future use of Huia Street Reserve Statement of Proposal. Are we ready to vote? Are we ready to vote? Right, I will invite you to vote on those recommendations. Great, that has carried 14 in favour and 1 against. And our final recommendation was the additional recommendation 8. And that is that the submissions received on the Huia Street Reserve Statement of Proposal be referred to any future Palmerston North City Council decision-making process about Huia Street Reserve. I'll invite you to vote on that one. That has carried 15%. Sorry, 100%, 15 in favour. There's been a lot of reading in the past couple of minutes. Right, we'll now move on to item 9, the annual Section 10A Dog Control Act 1996 report to the Secretary of Local Government, and we have got Kerry Lee coming down to present that.
Afternoon, councillors. I have Herb Vestigen here with me today. He's the team leader of Animal Management and Education. So he's here to assist with any questions that you might have. As you know, we are required to produce an annual report on the administration of the dog control policy and practices each year. And then once those are approved, they are published on the Palmerston North City Council website. So we're open to any questions you might have on the report.
Thank you. I've got a couple of questions to start off with. On page 329 of our papers, it's just got the pound operating hours and a comment about the emergency release of animals outside of these hours is available but subject to an additional fee. I'm just wondering how often we would get requests for people to come outside of those hours, whether that's a common occurrence. But just noting that those hours are within traditional business hours if people are working.
Afternoon, Madam Chair, councillors. Very rarely. That option is in there for out-of-town visitors whose dog may have scarpered, or if the animal is in need of veterinary treatment or under current veterinary treatment or needs medication. Those would be about the only times that we would release an animal after hours, so perhaps once or twice a year.
Okay, thank you. And then just my second question was, on the bottom of page 329 and continuing over to 330, the bullet points around preferred owners. So there's a comment around having less than one substantiated complaint about their dogs in the last 12 months. So is that actually indicating that a preferred owner has no complaints, or is one accepted? I wasn't quite sure what less than one meant.
Madam Chair, it should state have no more than one, so I'm not sure why that's a typo there. So one substantiated complaint is acceptable to be a preferred owner.
Okay. I guess just making sure then that's noted to be amended in the
yes,
report. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks for the report. I note there's mention in the report of the MPI audit that was conducted in March 2020, and it says that additional improvements were made. Can you tell me if the pound now meets all aspects of the Code of Welfare for the temporary housing of companion animals?
The facility still doesn't meet all the requirements. Where we fall short is a quarantine facility and a isolation unit. Those, to add those two to our current facilities would mean major construction, but as it sits, every other aspect of the Code of Minimum Standards is being met.
So in relation to those two facilities where we're not able to meet the code, what happens if you get a pup in with parvovirus, for example?
The way that the facility is set up at the moment is that there are two kennel blocks within the facility, and it's currently operated as one being in use at any one time, which allows us to isolate an animal in the other block should we need to. So whilst there is no standalone isolation or quarantine facility, we do have the means to isolate animals within the current facility.
And is there any proposed improvement in the pipeline other than the new pound, which is not going to be built until next financial year?
No, there isn't.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Finlay.
Oh, sorry. The mayor had distracted me. I was looking at your complaints and sector about dog attacks. I said dog attacks are up 9%, but I couldn't see where any dogs were put down. Maybe I just missed it, but how many dogs were put down in there because of the attacks?
In the last, excuse me, in the last financial year, there were 51 dogs euthanised. That's 13% of the total number impounded.
What was the main reason? That just because they were picked up and not reclaimed, or?
The main reason for euthanisation is that they're not suitable for rehoming. Excuse me.
Were many of them because of attacks on human beings?
I couldn't say offhand, sir. The reason that they are euthanised is that they're not suitable for rehoming, and some of those will be from the result of a dog attack, either on a person or another animal, or by breed type, where we have the policy of not rehoming pit bull type dogs.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Dingle.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for this report. Looking at page 328, it talks about when we sort of changed the policy on dog control to allow dogs in the CBD, and there were some submissions. Some submissions were opposing it at that stage. I'm just wondering, do we have any info about whether any of those concerns actually did happen now that we've adapted this? So is there an increase of dog feces in the CBD, or is there any info around that?
We've not received any large number of complaints in regards to dogs in the CBD. The most number of complaints that we have received is dogs not being on a leash rather than fouling.
Excellent, thank you.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, sorry, just occurred to me that I needed to ask another question, thank you. Following the MPI audit, has there been further discussion with MPI about meeting the Code of Welfare?
MPI were quite satisfied with the works that were undertaken in regards to their recommendations, and are now satisfied that with the new facility being in the pipeline, that we are meeting the requirements we need to and best we can.
Okay, thank you.
Councillors, are there any other questions? Great, thank you, Hub and Kerry Lee, for presenting that report. So I will move the recommendation, seconded by the Deputy Mayor, thank you. Is there any comment? Councillor Johnson.
Sorry, I do feel the need to make comment because there was some quite justifiable concern and comment around us not having a facility that met the Code of Welfare for the temporary housing of companion animals. So I do think that, and we are in a situation now where the temporary fixes have at least allowed us to meet the code in the short term. And I am reassured to hear that MPI have accepted the fixes that we've been able to do, and so long as we continue along the path of constructing the new pound, which will be able to meet all of the requirements, that they're happy to approve our facility. So given that, I'd just like to say that gives me a bit of reassurance about welfare of dogs and other animals in the pound, and also just to commend the animal control staff for their work, because it's not easy work, and nevertheless it's very valuable, and I think we've seen substantial improvements in this area over the last few years, so just wanted to mention that.
With no other comments, we will vote. So the resolution is that the committee resolve that the report on the dog control policy and practices for Palmerston North City Council pursuant to Section 10A of the Dog Control Act 1996 for the period 2019-20 as attached to the memorandum entitled Annual Section 10A Dog Control Act Report to Secretary of Local Government, presented to the Planning and Strategy Committee on 14 October 2020 be received, and I'll invite you to vote on that. That has carried 100%. Now move on to the committee work schedule on page 339. And I'll invite the Acting General Manager to make any comments.
I have no specific comment.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Great, that is moved by Councillor Hapara, seconded by the Deputy Mayor. Thank you. Any comment? Great, I'll invite you to vote. That's carried 100%. We now move on to item 11, which is the exclusion of the public. So I'll move that the public be excluded from the following parts of the proceedings of this meeting listed in the table below, and that is item 12, flood risk modelling information, for reasons that it is public interest and legal privilege. I will move that, seconded by Councillor Hancock. Any comment? Councillor Barrett.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I'm concerned that we are continuing to see reports sort of constructed and brought to us in a way that takes a whole lot of information that rightly sits in part one and sort of sprinkles it with a light dusting of part two information and sort of uses that to drag the whole thing into part two. And I think this item on the flood risk modeling is quite a good case in point. The substantive discussion on the principles of the matter, the strength of the modeling, the potential weaknesses of the modeling, etc., can and well should be discussed in part one. There's undoubtedly public interest in it, and no reason for it not to be discussed in part one. The only thing I can really see in here is that sprinkling of a few specific examples of model outputs that could potentially justify going into part two, but in my view, those examples of outputs are actually extraneous and not necessary to the decision-making process. And I would remind folks that in the Goima, the word necessary is a critical word in the decision-making path towards part one or point two. Is it simpler, easier, more convenient, more comfortable, etc.? Absolutely, but is it necessary in my view? No, and I'm going to be voting against this in the hopes that the construction of future reports takes greater cognizance of the clarity between part one and part two, so that we can be as open and available as possible in our decision-making processes. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. With no other comments, I'll invite you to vote. That has carried 13 in favour and 3 against. We are just going to adjourn for a couple of minutes while we switch everything over to part two.